Hello, everyone. This is the slideshow video for debating policy because our new resolution is a policy resolution. That is, you're going to defend a change in policy by the cities. The resolution says that cities should implement a policy of defunding the police. So what we're going to talk about here is how to build that case and what are called the stock issues. The stock issues are the things that you have to prove in order to prove your case. In other words, these are the points of contention that we'll be arguing in these next debates. If the negative refutes any of these points of contention, then they win the debate because in debate there's a thing called the burden of proof. And it's sort of like innocent until proven guilty in a court trial. That is, the prosecutor has to prove the case, and if they haven't proven it beyond a doubt, then the person is deemed innocent. The same thing here. The affirmative must prove the case, and if the negative can deny one of these points, then the affirmative has not met their burden of proof. So what are these points of contention or the stock issues? First is inherency. This one's not usually argued. It's just kind of a what's going on right now, what is happening in the status quo. For most of our cases, this is going to be evidence about how much the police are being funded right now, right? Evidence that says 70% of city budgets go to the police, or the police are way overfunded right now. So what's going on? What adheres in the status quo? What is the problem? If one way this might be argued would be if you could prove that cities weren't overfunding their police, or that cities were beginning to defund police already, then you could say, look, there's no inherency. This problem is already being taken care of. The next is called the harms. This is basically what's the problem, what's the harm, right? What's wrong with the status quo? Then the significance, why is that harm significant? What's the problem? Is it large or is it important? If you say there's a lot of racism in policing now, maybe giving us a sense of that leads to the killing and abuse of people of color would be the significance. At a 2.5 times rate of white people. So these couple of the harms and significance form what are called your advantages, right? That is the things that would be an advantage to your plan, your policy. And then the solvency, this is the final stock issue. It's the question of, does the policy work? Does it solve the harm? Does it take care of the problem that you have outlined? Obviously, if the negative proves that there's no harm, right, there's not racism in policing right now, or that you wouldn't solve the problem, that defunding the police will, make the problem worse, or not lead to less racism, then they win the debate because you haven't proven that there's a need for change, that there's a need to do this policy. So basically, harms and significance, just, what is it? What's the problem? How extensive is the problem? What kind of, harm, impact does it cause? And again, the inherency, is it inherent to the thing identified? Right? So some possible affirmative harms or advantages that we have out there. This might not be all of them, and you're welcome to form different advantages. But these are the ones that I have seen so far on the blog, so I'm just going to mention them here. One is social services. The idea that if we defunded the police, we could shift more money into services for mental health, addiction, domestic abuse, homelessness, etc. So that's a possible advantage or harm that the affirmative could solve. Obviously, over-policing people of color, all the issues about racism in policing could be a possible advantage. Better training or better policing. There's some arguments we have out there about how police are overburdened right now because they have to deal with all these issues like homelessness and domestic abuse, and they don't really know how to deal with them. And so by taking those tasks off their plate, they'll be able to focus on crime and better solve crime. They'll also get better training because they won't have to be trained in those instances. They'll only be trained for fighting crime and dealing with violence and things like that. Accountability. One of the arguments, obviously, behind the lack of accountability for police is because they have such a large budget, they're able to sort of throw their weight around. So if you defunded the police, maybe then they would be more accountable when there was abuse and such. And then finally, demilitarization. A large part of police budgets right now goes to things like SWAT vehicles and AR-15s and armor and stuff like that. And so there's an argument to be made that defunding the police would lead to less them arming themselves less. And there's also an argument that a militarized police force sort of sends the wrong signal, right? It hurts police community relations and gives police themselves what some people call the warrior mentality. They think that they're out there fighting a war when actually they're supposed to be protecting and serving. And that's one of the things that leads to more abuse and such. So these are some of the possible affirmative harms or advantages that you might build with your case. And then after the advantage, or at the bottom of the advantage, you would put in your solvency, your evidence for why this plan would take care of the problem. And it answers certain questions like, how does your plan solve the problem? Enforcement, who would do this policy, and how would you get them to comply? Maybe some of the arguments here about social services and social service workers, right? This would be evidence that said, hey, social service workers would get the money and take over those duties that the police were used to be doing right now. And then just in general, kind of the question of solvency, workability. Is this possible? Do the means exist? How would it work, right? And would it actually take care of the problem? So I'm just going to walk you through a sample case here. I'm only listing the claims, so it's sort of like an outline of the case. Obviously, for each of these claims, you would want to provide either sources or reasoning of your own for why these things would work or take care of the problem or are a problem. But I'm just going to show you sort of an outline of a sample case here. So I usually start off with inherency. Maybe I start off and say, right now, the average major city spends 60% of their budget on policing. And then I read some data or some evidence that backs that up. And instead, we have a plan. Our plan is that cities should cut those budgets by half and shift that money into social services. So this is, you get a little leeway as the affirmative to, specify what your policy of defunding the police would be. You should probably base it off of some of the blogs and experts out there that are advocating specific policies. But you want to spell out in a plan what your specific policy is. Now I move on to Advantage 1, social services. First, social services are strapped for cash in most cities. And again, remember, I'm going to add evidence or support to each of these points, but I'm just kind of outlining it for you here. Second point, police are thus forced to respond to these problems and are not trained to do so. They're often forced to respond to like domestic disputes or a homeless person or someone that's mentally ill or whatever. This leads to untreated mental health problems, untreated addictions, and underserved homeless people. That is that they don't get to social services. Instead, we just call the cops on them. And the significance of this is crime. Crime is often driven by homelessness and mental illness. So when we're not treating those things, then crime tends to go up. And then finally, my solvency, defunding the police would address these problems by providing for more social workers and sending social workers instead of police to deal with these issues. My advantage 2 is policing. And I just want to take a second here to mention that you should break up these advantages over the course of the first 2 speeches. Maybe the first speech kind of does the inherency and the plan and 1 advantage, maybe 2 advantages, depending on how much time you have. And then the second speech would offer another new advantage or 2. So here, imagine that I'm moving into my 2AC, and we will offer a second advantage of better policing. Our first point, police are currently overburdened responding to minor crimes or things that aren't even crimes. Worse yet, police are not even trained to handle these situations, so they often handle them poorly. Even further, this adds to the burden and stress on police, making some police officers quit and making it harder to fill positions with qualified and educated people. The significance of this is, again, crime. The police need to focus on crime to solve crime, but they're not focused on crime at the moment. And finally, some more solvency. Defunding the police would free them up to focus on crime. Advantage 3, over-policing of minority neighborhoods. First point, the police spend most of their time in minority neighborhoods. We have all those evidence about racial profiling or how much focus they spend in neighborhoods. Implicit bias and racial profiling lead police to search, arrest, harass, and kill people of color more often. And again, maybe I would offer a piece of evidence or 2 on that. This harms police community relations, making the jobs of police tougher and escalating encounters. That is, because the police are in minority neighborhoods so much and harassing them and such, then people don't trust the police. So when they pull them over, they're more likely to resist their orders and such, which can escalate the encounters. Something we've seen with the shooting in Kenosha recently, where it seemed like the person was frustrated with the police. Significance, I might add some statistics on the amount of death and abuse that occurs at the hand of police. And again, solvency. Defunding the police would force police departments to roll back their over-policing and really only focus on the most significant crimes. So next slideshow on Tuesday, we'll talk about some negative arguments. I know this was more focused on the affirmative side of this debate. But again, if the negative can just refute these advantages or refute this solvency or refute these harms and win the debate, but also they will be able to offer their own disadvantages, right? Negative consequences that might come from, from defunding the police. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm hoping that giving you an example will help you to build these cases strongly. I want to emphasize, continuing to use your blogs and your briefs to build your case, and also to using all of your speech time. Remember, you see how on each of these advantages I have 3 to 4 different distinct points. The more diverse and distinct points you have to back up your case, the more difficult you make it on the other team to rebut that case. And the stronger case you tend to build. So use all of your time, make as many different arguments as you can make, and back them up with your briefs and your sources. I hope you have a good weekend, and I will see you in a couple weeks for our next debates. Take care.